Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Natter with Niamh. And this week I have the delightful Rebecca Mabanglo-Mayor, whose name I'm not quite sure I've pronounced correctly, who is a writer and a storyteller. And I can't wait to talk to her. Good afternoon, Rebecca.
Hi. Hello, thank you for having me, Niamh. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Now, you said that one of your, I can't remember the name of the author now, one of the your greatest influences is another author. And you are a writer of books yourself, aren't you?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Right now, I've had several authors who've influenced me over the years, but the one who is influencing me most is Nick Bantock. And Nick is actually from the UK originally. He lives closer to me in North America. I live in Washington State, close to Seattle. And he is a surrealist. Uh, Multimedia artist. He actually started in picture books and pop-up books, but then in the 80s, put out a series called the Griffin and Sabine series. And what was interesting about that series is that you were reading letters, but it wasn't just reading the text. You were actually opening up envelopes and pulling out the letters to read them. You were reading the postcards, and all of the art was his original art. And his art is one of those things where you look at it and you see one thing, and the next day you see something different. And the
Mhm.
way it influences the text is really awesome. And so he really opened up this idea of, for me, of things being much bigger than we expect things to be. You know, a person's life, where they are, what influenced them, all of those things are there, but they might not necessarily be emphasized um, until someone kind of starts to look at it. It's like, oh, there's a lot of blue in this, but there's a spot of yellow. What does the yellow mean? And you get curious. And it's that curiosity, I think, that really drives a lot of my writing. Whether I'm being curious about my past and I'm looking at that through the lens of memoir, or I'm curious about, well, so what would happen if I happened to meet a shape changer all of a sudden? I don't know. Let's see where that goes. And then it's just writing out what I think might happen and seeing where that takes me. And that's kind of how I approach storytelling too, even though I might know the bones of a story, like Little Red Riding Hood. You always know there's got to be a little girl
Yeah.
in a red hood, a grandmother, and a wolf. But it can be so much bigger. It can go in a different way. There was a movie that came out called Hoodwinked, where you find out the grandma is actually uh, a spy. And she has this kind of James Bond life that the little girl doesn't know about.
Mhm.
And it's a wonderful take on things. And stories are wonderfully malleable that way. And then they reveal something not only of the context of where it's being told, but also what's been retained. What is important about a little girl? What's important about a wolf? What's important about a grandma? Start asking those questions, and then it opens it up even more. And so that's what his work has done, and shown me that, okay, this really weird idea that I thought no one's going to even understand. Why not? Throw it on the page, see what happens.
Yeah, I love that. And I love, that you brought in because one of the things you said, was people's origin stories or, the stories from our cultures and how they influence us. That's one of the things that you said that's kind of is going back into your own stories of influenced you. And the fact that, actually we can get quite pedantic about our stories as well, though, can't we? I mean, we might say that, well, Little Red Riding Hood, she has to go into the woods, she has to meet the wolf, there has to be the woodcutter, there has to be this, and you can't change who grandma is.
Mhm.
But why or how,
Yeah.
so why can we not? But also, you said, our stories teach us things.
Hmm. Right. Right.
They're our great
Yeah.
teachers.
Yeah. And that's the reason why they persist. So going back into the origin of the Little Red Riding Hood stories. Um, And I apologize if I'm being appropriative, because this is a story that comes out of, as far as I understand, your region of the world as opposed to my region of the world. Um, they were the Little Red Riding Hood story was actually part of a larger set of stories that were focused on the ways in which women are should be raised, what it's like to be in puberty, and then what it is to become a woman of power. And it got shrunk down for various reasons, not the least of which is typically marketing. Um, so what fascinates me is what's retained, what's important about that story that just sticks and that people will argue. I mean, it's kind of like recipes, right? I always joke about if you get seven Filipinos in a room and you all talk about adobo, everyone's going to have a different recipe and they're going to say, no, mine is authentic because my grandmother taught me this. Oh, you think
Yeah.
that? No, 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 you shouldn't put that ingredient in. That doesn't make it adobo. That's terrible. Like you say, pedantic and at the same time incredibly rich because it all tastes good. It all tastes good.
Yeah.
So why prevent anyone from creating something new because it's a new context? Uh, One of the things that from my story, adobo, I got that recipe from my dad, and when I took it into my own family, they liked it just fine. Then my daughter started adding a new ingredient. And I was like, I'm not sure you like it, but I'm not sure I'd like it. Well, it's become part of the recipe now. And that becomes part of the story. It's not just my dad adding things my cousins will not eat that's in there. It's like
Mm.
cloves. You're putting cloves in. Why would you do that? And then moves it forward to ginger. We've added ginger to this. Okay, now is this really adobo? It's that, what is that traditional story about how many times do you take apart a ship and put it back together before it stops being that ship? Are you familiar with that one? I can't
No,
quite
I'm
remember
not,
it.
but yeah, I mean that is yeah, it's kind
Yeah,
of
and so it's like the same thing happens with folk tales. The retelling is as telling as the original is. And so, I live in Coast Salish territory, the traditional lands of the Nooksack, the Lummi, the Swinomish, all of those. And they talk about how stories aren't just teaching stories of behavior, but they're also ways of being and how to do things, how to make a net out of this particular plant, how to know when it's the best time to go out and fish. These are the things that are important. But in order for it to be retained in the brain, it's created into a story. And that's the reason why I love them so much, because there's so much information and I get curious about what's been left out. I mean, like I said, I'm Filipino. We were colonized by the Spanish. And then just when we thought we were going to get out from underneath the Spanish rule, the Americans did an end run, and all of a sudden we're an American colony. And what stories persisted from those early days of the Spanish being in the Philippines in the 16th century to now? And then mourning the loss of the things, the details that have gotten lost, because they knew that if they told it in a certain way, in a certain space, they were going to be imprisoned and possibly killed. That was just the way it was in colonization.
yeah.
So, those there is also that mourning of what's been lost. And yet stories are so strong. You can kind of, like I was saying about Nick Bantock and the colors, you can find that one little thing and then draw it out and go, oh, wait, if this persisted this long, it either got hidden and no one really knows what it's connected to, or people do know, but they're not going to talk about it. It's like an underground movement. We do not talk about that particular detail because that is the key to something else. So fascinating to me. So yeah, I look at
Yeah.
stories, I look at how they apply to me, how they might apply to other things, and I just have a lot of fun.
the hidden meanings. I mean, I know certainly, I mean, from my years ago history lessons in school when we had penal law in Ireland, and we had schools became what they called hedge schools. So children were
Mm.
actually they weren't allowed in classrooms. Irish children weren't allowed to be in classrooms or be
Oh,
taught. So
right.
some people developed what they called hedge schools. So they would be taught like under hedges in a field and things.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, I don't. I mean, I wasn't big into history back then, so I don't
Hmm.
know a lot about it. But I do know, that we have a lot of Irish folklore that's been passed down, and
Hmm.
lots of stories. In fact, my name comes from one of the greatest of the Irish legends, um,
Really?
from Niamh Keenor. So that was Niamh of the golden hair, and she used to ride this great big white horse, and she came from Tirnanog, which is the land of the forever youthful,
Hmm.
and she
Hmm.
would come to Ireland and take young men and take them back with her to be her companions. And
That's awesome. That's
but
awesome.
and again, I don't know what the message behind that story is. I don't know what hidden meanings. I don't know what meanings I mean, we were just told them as stories.
Sure.
And for us, they became the whole point of the stories was she took one young man back, Usheen back, and he hadn't realized how much time had elapsed. And he decided he wanted to come back to Ireland, but it was
Uh-huh.
300 years later, and nobody
Uh-huh.
he knew was still alive.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Um, and then he got off his horse to help somebody who was in trouble.
Hmm.
And of course, the
Hmm.
minute he stepped off his horse, he aged
Hmm.
like anything.
Hmm. Hmm.
Remember the end? I can't remember what happens after that, but I just remember. And I guess that story to me is all about, not trying to constantly grasp onto youth. I guess that could be the
Oh,
meaning
okay.
behind that story.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
But I have no idea what the meaning is and why we were told those stories. But it's just, it was part of the traditional Irish storytelling, you know?
Yeah. And the way my approach to that is sure we could maybe go back if we had if we had the TARDIS, right? We could go back in time and we could see what really happened. But for the most part, those stories developed over time.
Mhm.
And so what's more interesting to me in you telling that story about your name is how it impacts you and that you are talking about it, youth is not something to be pursued because it is so easily lost. Okay,
Yeah.
that is what it means. That's the way you would retell it. And that's awesome. And then someone else might come along and is like, but there's this one other detail. And then it gets enriched from there. It's when people say this is the way this needs to be. It's not authentic if you don't do it this way. That's when I get super impatient. It's like, no, no, stories are kind of like this. Stories are conversations. Conversations with what's going on now, what's going on in the past, and what you hope for in the future. That's rich. That's a rich thing. And, you know, saying that youth is something that you shouldn't constantly pursue, that reflects to me a space of you saying, hey, this is how old I am. Deal with it. And if you can't deal with it, get off the horse. You will get it eventually,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's a reclamation of self, which I think is so powerful. Okay, there it is, right in your name. It's constantly reminding you of that. That's beautiful.
Yeah, but as I said, we were never taught, and like maybe we were taught. I just don't remember because it's so long
Sure.
ago. I heard those
Yeah.
stories, but I mean, I love the fact that you say we can change and embellish the stories, and actually, we need to do that in a way because
Mhm.
a story that's told 200, 300 years ago may not be quite relevant to how we're living today.
Exactly.
But if we can
Exactly.
take the main message of that story,
Mhm.
say the message is to be true to yourself or whatever, and
Right.
adapt that story so that it fits in with today's
Yeah. Exactly.
social
Just like the
ideas,
recipe.
then
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
perfect. That's perfect.
I mean, it's like your
Yeah.
recipe. We're changing to
Exactly.
modern tastes.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And as
And
food
that's
changes
the
as
beauty of
well.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That doesn't make it any less of what it was. It's not so true to the original, which, as far as the research has shown, actually it's a dish that didn't originate in the Philippines, but it was something influenced by the trade that was happening through through Acapulco, along that route. And so then there's the Philippines is not really one country. They were just squished together because it was easier for the map makers. But there were at least
Yeah.
five distinct cultures. They were friendly with each other. They did trade with China and all of that sort of stuff. But it wasn't this monolith of Filipinos only do this thing. And breaking that apart and saying, okay, well, if that's true, and I think it is, what have we missed because we're trying to make this monolith of a culture? What did we miss?
Mm.
And that's exciting to me too.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, when you think about when you look at the United Kingdom, like we have
Mhm.
Wales, Scotland, and England, and the
Mhm.
cultures are very. I mean, the Welsh. I mean, I'd say the Welsh and Scottish cultures are maybe a bit more similar, but they're very definitely they're more like the Scottish culture is definitely more similar to the Irish culture. Our
Mhm.
language is very similar as well.
Mhm.
Um, so
Okay.
yeah, I mean, there is definitely, yeah, you can definitely see different cultures. So somewhere like the Philippines, I mean, why would you think it would all be one big mishmash?
Well, it's funny you're talking about language. So my father was Tagalog, which is known as the national language of the Philippines. Okay. But my mother was Pangasinan and Ilocano. And so my mother, she was multilingual. She knew Tagalog, she knew Pangasinan, she knew Ilocano, and she knew American English. Okay,
Mm.
great. The reason why is because anytime my grandmother didn't want my grandfather to know something, she would speak in her own language rather than his language. And if I remember right, my cousins will probably correct me one way or another. She would speak Pangasinan because he only understood Ilocano. So they would have this secret language, which is how I grew up. If my parents didn't want me to know something, they would speak Tagalog to each other because Tagalog and English were the only languages my father spoke. And so there's
Yeah,
this really interesting thing, and sometimes it's protective, sometimes it's cheeky. It's all about being human, right? And
yeah.
then language flexes. You get influenced by each other. And yeah, I love that.
I mean,
One
all
day I'm going to get to
languages
where
are,
you live.
yeah. I mean, English particularly, we've stolen words from
Yeah.
languages all over the place.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
kind of,
Yeah.
and language changes and evolves as well.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
guess as our language changes and evolves, our stories have to change and evolve. I
Exactly.
mean, everything has to change and evolve at
Exactly.
some point. Um, so I don't think we can be fixed on our stories. But you mentioned something about how our origin stories can help us
Yeah.
in our
Um,
lives.
so the reason I became a performance storyteller is because in what the way I open my shows is in the year 2000, I realized I wasn't a white man. And that's to get laughs, right? Because it's obvious I am not a white man, but it reflects how I was raised. I was raised to be at least as good as a white man because that was only the only way a woman of color was going to survive. But then I went to a woman of color conference and I saw all of these academics, people who I admired, and they're all people of color. I was like, okay, well, this is self-oppression. What am I going to do about it? Understanding that the reason why the last two, three generations of my family survived is because they could, I want to say manipulate, but they could work with the dominant culture of that time.
Yeah,
But how am I going to understand my own heritage if I don't have a connection to it that has the least amount of colonization as possible? And I can see what was lost. And so I started looking at Filipino folktales. These were not folktales I grew up on. I didn't know who Juan Tamad was. I didn't know who Marcelo was. I didn't know any of these as I grew up on Three Little Pigs and all of that sort of stuff. Didn't
yeah,
have these other stories. So like I said, what's culturally missing? So I started retelling these stories, and it shifted my relationship to my own culture. It was no longer the thing that we left behind, the thing that we hide in order to be safe. It became, hey, look, so there's this really great story about this silly guy named Juan Tamad, and he tricks the king. and this is how it goes, and it becomes fun. And not just for me as a storyteller, but to my audience, because they're trying to figure out, why is she telling this story backwards? And why am I laughing so much? Because everything is getting more and more ridiculous, even though it's going. It's stuff like that that have strengthened me in my own sense of identity through the reclamation of story. And that's the reason why I get so excited when people are like, oh, well, the thing that really annoys me after shows, people who are of European descent coming up to me and saying, oh, you are so lucky. You have you have a heritage, you've got a culture. I don't have anything. And I'm like, honey, you yeah, I think you're missing the point that of colonization and why you're here, and how it was that you were escaping something from your original place of being. And you might want to look at that, but that doesn't mean, just because you don't know it doesn't mean you don't have it.
Yeah.
And
And it's that curiosity, isn't it? It's getting curious about.
yeah, and
Yeah.
then really seeing, grieving the loss, and seeing how just, we are talking about these are the smallest denominators when you tell Little Red Riding Hood. So the smallest things, it's the things you put in your pockets as you're going across an entire ocean and then making sense of it on the other side. Okay, so what does that do for stories? And then you take those bits and you take it back to where it came from and go, oh, it's much bigger, which means I'm much bigger. And
Mm.
as a person who is not Filipino, you don't have to take my stories in order to make your stories make sense. So it's protective as well as revelatory, which I enjoy.
There's also, I mean, I think I mean, when we look back to our cultural stories, our folklore and the things, the stories there's an awful lot of similarity
Mhm,
in cultures. There's an awful lot of the same messages,
mhm.
just told in a different way with different characters,
Exactly, exactly.
because we're all human.
We're all human. We all have human experiences. We all have to eat. Like I was saying, the traditional stories around where I live, Coast Salish territory, they're teaching stories. This is how you harvest this particular herb at this particular time. And then you can weave it into a net that will catch you fish. But it's made into a story because it's easier to retain. And
Yeah.
there's typically, a repetition in there, uh, talking about the three little pigs, and the wolf coming to the door, and not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. For some reason,
Yeah.
that's the
He
line
huffs
that's
and he
sticking in my
puffs and
head.
he blows
Right.
the house down.
Blows the house down. So that repetition sinks the story into the body. And if it's a storyteller on stage, they're doing that even more because they're using their body to reinforce. So what's the clue? What's the thing that we're trying to retain? Okay, in a teaching story of how to make a net, it's so that you can get a net to catch fish.
Yeah.
But it's also about teamwork, right? Because you can't do it by yourself. So how do you work with others? And
The
so
little red
there's
hen.
exactly, how do you get along with these things? They're talking about the little red hen, right? The version
Yeah.
that I know is she's running around, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Oh my gosh, we're all gonna
Oh
die.
no, that's Chicken Little.
Oh, that's Chicken Little. So
Little red
little
hen
red
is
hen.
she wants to bake a loaf of bread.
Oh,
She tried
okay.
to do it all by herself.
Okay, no, I had forgotten about that one. Anyway, there's a local story about a crow or a raven who is told as he's trundling along that he shouldn't go to the water because that dirty old thing is there and octopus woman is going to eat you. And he's like, oh yeah, whatever. And he goes along very blithely. Well, everyone knows that he's not taking the wisdom of the people around him and he's doing what he wants anyway. And yeah, he gets eaten by octopus woman. And it's not just, and gone. There's this whole ritual between the two of them of, oh, the octopus woman is complimenting him and making him feel like he's this wonderful creature as she wraps each tentacle around his little body and then brings him down, you know. And so, like you said, what can we take from that in that particular moment that we're in? So, in one part of our lives, it's very important. Don't go to the water alone. If you see an octopus in a tide pool, don't touch it. It's bad, right? And
Mm.
then in another part, it's, oh, you should listen to the people around you and not just think you're all that and you've got all the answers, right? That's a
Yeah.
wonderful teaching story. And it's incredibly entertaining with someone who knows the story so well. I apologize to the co-sailors watching me now going, that's not the way you tell that story.
I don't know that story. I mean, it sounds fascinating. I might have to go and look it up. But but one of the things that, has struck me when I first sort of put out the idea for this podcast, is I had a few people come to me and say,
Mhm,
I don't have any stories. My life is so boring. I don't have a story. And I was thinking, actually, we all have a story. Like,
mhm,
stories are everywhere, they're all around us. When we go for
mhm.
coffee with a friend and we sit there and we're telling them about our day yesterday, or we're telling them about
Exactly.
somebody we met,
Yes,
that story. But
exactly.
we don't think of it as that, do we?
No.
No.
And part of that, we were talking about marketing earlier. Part of that is that we're told that only a certain type of person can have a story that will be published, will be produced in a movie, will be made into a song, and those are the stories of value. And if you can't do that, then your story is sort of like, not as important. It's not a big deal. And that's just not true because it was important to you in that
Mm.
moment. The details may change. And and that's okay. That's that's totally fine. And when people tell me, oh no, I don't have a culture, I don't have a story, I'll pick up a pen and I'll say, tell me about this pen. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, what is the first thing you think about when you see this pen? Oh, I had a teacher when I was in grade school and she hated my handwriting and I couldn't cross anything out and I'm terrified. I don't like pens anymore. I only use pencils. It's like, that's important. That teaches other people to not be a jerk about how a person's handwriting is. That's the teaching story, you know. And so
And that is a
I feel like,
story, even though
yeah,
she
it's
told
yeah,
you she didn't have a story.
she didn't have a story. She just told me a
Story.
story.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so when I teach my classes, I'll often say it's like, okay, pick an object, any object in the room, and connect it to a piece in your past, and then tell me what you want it to be in the future.
Wow,
Go
I
for
love
15
that.
minutes. Go for 15
Yeah.
minutes. Just write. And if you get stuck, repeat the word that you just wrote and then go from there. And it's all about generating and honoring the story within, that you don't have to have Warner Brothers, um, uh, Simon and Schuster, any of those folks. They don't have to tell you who you are. You know who you are because you can tell stories about yourself. Great. Roll with that. I want to hear it, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. And what I love about the power stories is that even, you might think your story is really mundane and boring, but if you've met somebody who maybe hasn't spoken to somebody else for a few days and they're feeling lonely and you say
Uh-huh.
hello and you get talking and you tell a little story,
Mhm,
that can make their day. That can give them a real sense of connection.
mhm. Oh,
Even
absolutely.
just you telling a really mundane story.
Sure, sure.
And
Yeah.
it's just so powerful. And I think we don't give story enough credit in our current
Uh-huh.
culture. We don't, I mean, a
Uh-huh.
lot of the time, we don't even recognize kind of movies or TV shows. I mean, we don't think about the story behind them, really, do we?
Mhm.
We spend hours discussing them and discussing the characters, but,
Yeah.
we kind
Well,
of
and
lose
then
the story somewhere.
exactly. And then when it comes to a movie, there's the story that's being told. I'm a big Star Wars fan. I will nerd out about Star Wars until the cows come home.
I must
But
introduce it to
that
my son.
awesome. And And yes, George Lucas was the one who came up with the story. He was the one who thought about Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia and yada, yada, yada. However, to get it on the screen, there's the actors, there's the cameramen, there's the costumers, there's, John Williams with his music. All of that comes together into the story. That's interesting. But what's more interesting is, what's their story? Why did John Williams decide to compose versus being an accountant? That was
Mm.
probably a thing that was talked about when he was in school. Okay, maybe musicians aren't going to make as much as an accountant. Maybe you should do something safe. But he didn't. He took the risk, and he became this wonderful artist, influencing generations of people who don't even know his name because they aren't paying attention to the music. They're paying attention to the movie and are being influenced by the music. But the stories are there. The stories are there in the costume. Why did they pick that particular cut? Why did they, who was that person that they wanted to emulate? And then the actors, um, who are they thinking about in their past that is coming forward in this character? Either someone they wanted to be or someone they did not want to be. The best villains are the ones, okay, yeah, there was that neighbor of mine and she was horrible, and I'm going to be her. I'm going to show you exactly how horrible she was.
Yeah.
That's all story, and it all blends together. It always, and you wouldn't have the first episode of Star Wars. Don't get me started about what 1977 was all about. Um, without all of that stuff.
Mm.
It's all important. Every person's story is important. And I'm one of those people that goes into a coffee shop. And if I go regularly, I get to know the baristas. And I'm like, so, how'd it go last weekend with your kids at that thing? And they'll be like, oh, and they'll tell me their story because
Yeah.
I want them to know they're not just a person who's serving me coffee. That's dull. That's boring. I want to know that I'm in a community, and the way that we know we're in community is when we share our stories. So when you're talking about someone who's isolated, hasn't talked to anyone, that breaks my heart because we are designed to be in community. And one of the biggest
Yeah.
issues that I have with American culture is the lone cowboy. It's like, no, just do you see what's happening? Do you see what
Mm.
he does to the native people in order to feel like he's a hero? That's not good. Do you see how isolated he is and he is not unloved because he's riding off into the sunset? Why would we want that to be in our own lives? Why? And then the question is,
You
why
don't.
do we have single? Yeah, why do we have single heroes? What is it about single heroes that we find so interesting? And then there you go.
I
Like you
think
said,
that probably
curiosity.
that lone cowboy thing, it probably helps. I don't know, the people who feel alone feel better about themselves, or the people who find, I guess there are a certain echelon of people in society who struggle to with relationships.
Mhm,
And I guess,
mhm.
we can cast ourselves as in this lone cowboy role, and we're fantastic because, we can go it alone, we're tough, we're strong, we're not vulnerable, we don't need anybody. Then I
Yeah,
guess if you can see a hero that looks like that, I guess it gives you some sense, it gives you a sense of connection, which is
right.
what we're after all the time anyway.
Yeah, which is opposite of that ideal of
It
being
is.
alone.
Yeah.
So it's like, wait, you need someone to relate to in order to feel better about yourself. But that thing is, wait, what are you trying to say here? Yeah, and
But I
and
think that's kind of where the premises come from, really, isn't it? I
yeah,
guess. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to understand where, you know, because you don't know what was going on in the mind of the person who wrote that movie or
nope,
that story or whatever, and maybe that's what they were, you know, feeling. And again, wouldn't it be bliss if we could, you know, hear everybody's stories behind the stories? Like, I mean, when you
exactly.
said you were from near Seattle, I mean, I always think of Grey's Anatomy, which like kind of addicted to. It's the only thing I know about Seattle is that it rains all the time. And Meredith Grey lives there.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, yes, it does rain a lot, awful
But,
lot.
yeah.
It just it
But I
rains an
would
awful
like,
lot.
if we could. I would love to know who inspired all of that.
Yeah,
And also, I look at some of the things they do on that program and I think and I actually find myself Googling, like, is that real? Is that a real innovation? Is that a real operation? Can they really do that?
I
Or
really
is
do that.
this
Yeah,
all just fiction? How much of this is kind of real life?
yeah,
And, you know,
yeah. Well, and then for me, it's like, okay, you say this is in Seattle, but is it really Seattle? So I'm looking for those clues. I I've been reading this wonderful author by the name of Kira Jane Buxton, and she lives in a town that's a suburb of Seattle. And it's one of those apocalyptic stories, post-apocalyptic
yeah,
stories. Um, and she's talking about places I've stood. Jose Rizal Park. I know where that is. I know which part of the waterfront she's talking about. And so, in one way, it's like you look at a story to learn about that other place that you don't know if you're ever going to get there, right?
yeah.
And then the other is like, okay, does that really reflect my experience? And then the joy that comes of, yes, they got it right, versus the annoyance of, oh no, that would never happen. you know?
Yeah.
So place is very important when it comes to stories too, and that's often overlooked.
I mean,
So yeah,
I don't know if you've heard of the movie Educating Rita.
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it.
It's a movie. Yeah, I mean, I've seen it a few times, but it's a movie. It's meant to be based in one of the great British universities, so either Oxford or Cambridge, I can't remember which. But a lot of it was filmed in Dublin. And at one point, she's standing at a bus stop, and you can quite
Uh-huh.
clearly see the compass, oh, I can't remember the Irish word now, the CIE
Okay.
bus stop behind her. I'm sitting there thinking, I know that street. I know that bus stop. I've waited at it myself, and she's meant to be in Cambridge or Oxford, and
Right,
it's
right,
clearly
right.
a faux pas, but
Yeah,
it's like it kind of gives you a deeper connection to the movie, though, in some way.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
you
Even those
recognize
even those
something.
flaws. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
You got it. You got it. That's perfect.
but I like the story and everything and everywhere.
Mhm. Well, and just recently I saw the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. I don't know if you've seen that.
No, not
Um,
yet.
uh, it's wonderfully surrealistic, and I love surrealism. And it stars Michelle Yeoh and Ke Huy Quan and all of these stellar Asian actors who are now working in the United States on projects and things like this.
Yeah,
Michelle Kwan is from, if I remember right, Malaysia. Anyway, it's a story that tells stories based on what needs to happen within the story. So it's this multi-layer thing. So that's the reason why it's called Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
yeah,
And that's what our lives are. That's what our lives are. And when we tell the story, we take out one little thread and say, okay, this is what it is. But that's not the whole fabric of a person's story. And then where you get to know a
yeah.
person, I was like, okay, well, here's another one. And you build that trust. That's the other thing that needs to happen. We need to trust each other, not so much to tell the truth, but to tell what's authentic to ourselves and not what we think
Mhm.
someone else needs to hear in order for you to be accepted. It's that multiplicity that is humanity that I love, I look for, and I forget that I have it on a daily basis. Richard Bach used to say, you teach best what you most need to learn.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yes, I mean, yes, as they say, when we're giving advice, it's usually because we need to hear it ourselves.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep. That's exactly it. But we need to tell those stories in order to find that out.
Yeah,
If we're silent, that means we're being silenced by a story. What's that story that's silencing us? And then you get curious. Get
yeah.
curious.
And it all comes back to curiosity, doesn't it? And finding
Hmm.
out more about the story and, as you said, the different threads, the fabric, then we build like it's I'm kind of getting a picture here of kind of like a loom where you're
Hmm.
pushing, you've got all the threads, and as you
Hmm.
push the loom, you're building and building. So, and our stories build through out our lives, don't we? And
Right, right.
we can choose which parts of our stories we want to share. And that can change not only how people perceive us, but also it changes how we kind of live our lives as well.
Right.
Because you can choose to tell the story of your failures and continue failing,
Hmm.
or you
Hmm.
can choose one tiny little success
Hmm.
and then choose success from there on in and build
Right.
out. So, our story really
Exactly.
does have huge power.
Yeah. 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 And I'm looking at your shirt because your shirt has many fibers, right?
Yep.
And okay, so in one way you could emphasize the white, or another way you could emphasize the rainbow in it. And um, but that one thread doesn't tell the whole story of the sweater.
Yep. I
But
mean,
it
you probably can't see it's got
you pay
gold
it.
threads in it as well.
Yeah, exactly. And until you pointed it out to me, I would have missed that detail. That's
Yeah.
connection. That's the importance of community, which is it's all in there. And what I love about the weaving story is it doesn't start with the weaving. It starts with the making of the thread, right?
Which
Was it
starts with a
spun? Was it
sheep.
rolled?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, go
Or
back to the
yeah,
sheep.
to the farmer who
Perfect.
bought the sheep.
Right. And then the carding of the wool to get it smooth
Yeah.
enough in order to spin. The fabric, the clothing is the last bit, even though it reflects who the person is. Like I'm wearing a jeans jacket right now with lots of different buttons on it. So I don't have gold thread, but I got bling. I got bling. And people go, "Oh, so you're a Star Wars fan because you've got that button," or "Oh,
Yeah.
you like Miyazaki films because of that button?" Okay, let's tell stories that connect us. That's what I care about.
Yeah. I love that. And I think that is an absolute ideal point for us to finish this on. Um,
Perfect.
Stories that connect us. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining me today,
Thank you. I
Rebecca.
had a wonderful, wonderful time with you, and I hope we can talk again.
Okay, I hope so too. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.
You too. Bye.